I was halfway through my morning coffee when my daughter took my hand and said, "Mom, you've been forgetting things again." She said it gently, loud enough for the nurse to hear, quiet enough to sound concerned. That's when I realized this wasn't about my memory. It was about control. I'm Evelyn Harper, 68 years old, retired, widowed, and until recently, fully trusted my only child. I've lived in the same ranch house outside Dayton for 26 years. Beige siding, blue shutters, a grandfather clock that chimes on the hour and never misses a beat. Unlike the way my daughter claimed I did. My mornings were simple: percolated coffee, the local paper, church twice a week. I paid my bills on time. I balanced my checkbook the old-fashioned way: pencil, calculator, no confusion. Rachel started helping after my knee surgery. She offered to organize my mail, to handle appointments, to talk to the bank, just in case. At first, it felt like love. Then it felt like supervision. The first red flag came when a credit card statement didn't arrive. Rachel said I must have misplaced it. The second came when my doctor asked if I'd been missing medications I was never prescribed. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. Until the bank called and asked me to confirm a transfer I never made. Once my daughter said the word dementia out loud, everything in my life began to tilt, just slightly at first, like a picture frame knocked crooked on the wall. Nothing fell immediately, nothing shattered, but I could feel the balance shifting in ways I couldn't yet name. Rachel didn't accuse me directly. That's the part people don't understand about gaslighting at this age. It doesn't come with shouting or ultimatums. It comes wrapped in concern, in lowered voices, in sighs that say, "I hate to say this, but—" She started mentioning little lapses to other people when I was in the room. Forgetting a name at church, asking the same question twice, misplacing my glasses, which I've done since my 40s, long before it became a diagnosis. At first, I laughed it off. If forgetting where I put my keys means dementia, we're all in trouble, I said once, trying to keep things light. Rachel smiled, but it was tight, like I'd disrupted a script she was trying to follow. The changes came in quietly. She insisted on driving me to appointments I'd handled myself for years. She offered to organize my paperwork, which meant my mail started going through her hands before mine. Bank statements disappeared, then reappeared already opened. When I asked about it, she said, "You asked me to keep an eye on things, remember?" I didn't remember, but I also didn't want to sound defensive. That's another trick of gaslighting. You start policing your own reactions before anyone else has to. People around me began acting differently, too. My pastor asked gently if I was feeling overwhelmed lately. A neighbor offered to walk me home after Bible study, even though I'd lived on that street for decades. No one said the word dementia to my face, but I could feel it hovering in conversations like humidity before a storm. Rachel suggested I sign a medical release so she could help coordinate care. She brought the form already printed, pen uncapped, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Her expression didn't harden, it softened. "Mom," she said quietly, "this is exactly what I'm talking about." That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Because how do you argue with someone who frames your resistance as proof of your decline? I signed, and the moment I did, I felt something important slip through my fingers. Soon after, appointments started happening without me knowing. Rachel would tell me afterward what the doctor said. summarizing in that careful tone people use when delivering bad news to children. I asked which doctor. She said Dr. Whitman, my longtime physician. I asked when I'd seen him. She said, "Last time, don't you remember?" I did remember my last visit, and it hadn't included any conversations about cognitive decline. That was the first night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click unevenly as it rotated. I replayed every interaction from the past few months, trying to identify where I might actually be slipping. Was I forgetting more? Or was I just being told I was? There's a particular kind of fear that comes with aging. The fear that one day you'll lose your footing and not realize it until someone else points it out. Rachel was leaning on that fear with precision. The next morning, I called my bank myself. I'd done business with the same local branch for years. I knew the manager by name. When I asked for a copy of my last 3 statements, there was a pause. Not long, just long enough. "Mrs. Harper," the woman said carefully, "your daughter usually handles those requests." Usually. That word rang in my ears. I told her I wanted the statements sent directly to me. She hesitated again, then said she'd have to note the request. I hung up with my heart beating faster than it should have been. When the envelope arrived 2 days later, my hands shook, opening it, not from weakness, but from adrenaline. Several withdrawals were highlighted, modest amounts, spread out, nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms. But they weren't mine. I knew my spending patterns the way you know your own handwriting. These weren't mistakes. They were tests. Rachel noticed the envelope on my kitchen table that evening. "What's that?" she asked casually. I told her the bank statements had been delayed and I'd asked for replacements. She froze for half a second, just half. Then she smiled and said, "Oh, good. I was worried you'd forget to check them." I didn't correct her. Instead, I started writing things down. Not in a dramatic way. Just notes, dates, who said what I was told versus what I remembered. I bought a simple spiral notebook and kept it in my nightstand drawer. If Rachel mentioned an appointment, I wrote it down. If someone at church said something odd, I noted it. At first, it felt paranoid. Then it felt necessary. Rachel's concern escalated in small, strategic steps. She told me she'd spoken to an attorney friend about future planning. She floated the idea of power of attorney like it was a formality everyone my age eventually signed. When I didn't respond enthusiastically, she sighed and said, "This is what scares me, Mom. You don't realize how serious this is." Serious for whom? One afternoon, she showed up with a pamphlet about assisted living. She placed it on my counter between the sugar bowl and my mail, like it belonged there. "Just to look," she said. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She nodded sympathetically and said, "That's what people usually say at first." That night, I called an old friend, a retired nurse who'd known me since our children were small. I didn't tell her everything. I just asked, casually, what early dementia usually looked like. She asked a few questions of her own, practical ones. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Evelyn," she said, "if someone thinks you have dementia, they don't let you manage your own finances. And if they want your finances, they often say you have dementia." That was the moment the fear crystallized into clarity. I wasn't being protected. I was being positioned. The next escalation came from an unexpected place. My doctor's office called to confirm an appointment I hadn't scheduled. When I asked what it was for, The receptionist said, "A cognitive evaluation requested by your daughter." Requested? Without my knowledge. I canceled the appointment myself. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. When Rachel found out, she didn't yell. She cried, loudly, in my living room. She told me she was terrified of losing me, that she couldn't live with herself if something happened, and she hadn't tried to help. She said, "Please don't make me the bad guy for caring." I almost apologized. That's the most dangerous part of gaslighting. It makes you feel cruel for defending yourself. Instead, I nodded. Let her cry. And that night, I made copies of everything. Bank statements, insurance policies, deeds. I moved the originals to a safe deposit box Rachel didn't know about. I changed my online passwords, quietly, methodically. Because whether or not Rachel believed I was losing my mind, one thing was now undeniable. Someone was already trying to take control of my life. And the next move, hers or mine, would decide whether anyone believed me when it mattered most. Once I started protecting myself, the fear didn't disappear. It changed shape. Instead of wondering if something was wrong with me, I began wondering how far Rachel was willing to go to convince others there was. That question settled into my chest like a stone, heavy, unmoving, impossible to ignore. I became hyper-aware of everything. The way Rachel watched me when I spoke, like she was waiting for me to slip. The way she corrected me in front of others, gently but publicly. "No, Mom, that was last Tuesday," she'd say, smiling, even when I was right. People stopped looking at me when she did that. They looked at her. Authority shifted in real time, and I felt it happening. I started doubting myself in ways I hadn't since childhood. I'd walk into a room and forget why I was there, a perfectly normal human experience, and my heart would race. Is this it? I'd ask myself. Is this what it starts like? Gaslighting doesn't just make you question reality. It teaches you to surveil your own mind. At night, I lay awake replaying conversations, searching for proof of clarity, like it was something fragile I might lose if I wasn't careful. I remembered raising Rachel after her father died, managing a household, a career, finances, grief, all at once. I remembered decades of competence. But memory, once questioned, stops feeling like evidence. It starts feeling like testimony you're afraid won't hold up under cross-examination. Rachel escalated subtly but steadily. She began speaking for me more often. At church luncheons, if someone asked how I was doing, she'd answer before I could. "She's had a rough time lately," she'd say. "Some confusion." The word slid into conversations like it belonged there. No one challenged it. Why would they? She was my daughter. Who would know me better? The isolation crept in quietly. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. People became careful around me, choosing words the way you do around someone fragile. I'd spent my life being reliable, organizing, remembering, showing up. Now I was being managed. The emotional toll was worse than the financial threat. Money can be tracked, recovered, protected. But credibility? Once that starts to erode, it's almost impossible to rebuild, especially at my age. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. Rachel invited herself over after church. She brought a casserole, like she always did when she planned to have a serious conversation. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped her with homework, where bills had been paid on time for decades. She clasped her hands and said she'd been talking to a social worker. She said they were concerned. She said maybe it was time to Make some hard decisions. I asked, what kind of decisions? She slid a folder across the table. Inside were forms: power of attorney, medical proxy, financial oversight, everything neatly tabbed. My name typed at the top, her name everywhere else. I felt something tear inside me. Not dramatically, not loudly, but decisively. This wasn't concern anymore. It was execution. I asked her where she'd gotten the idea that I wasn't competent. She said she'd noticed patterns, missed calls, repeated stories. She said doctors agreed. I asked which doctors. She hesitated. Just a second. Then she said, "See? This is what I mean. You don't remember." That sentence ended something between us. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stood up, folded the papers, and handed them back to her. I said very calmly, "You don't get to do this without my consent." Her face hardened, not angry, but annoyed, like I'd broken a rule she assumed I'd follow. She said, "Mom, if you won't cooperate, I'll have to do what's best for you." That night, I cried for the first time since my husband died. Not because I was afraid of losing my independence, though I was, but because I realized my own child was willing to erase me to get what she wanted. That grief was sharper than any fear of aging. It cut cleanly through every excuse I'd made for her. The next morning, I called Dr. Whitman myself. His tone changed when I asked about dementia. Not defensive, confused. He said he'd never diagnosed me with anything remotely cognitive. He admitted Rachel had expressed concerns, but there was no clinical basis for them. He suggested, gently, that if I was worried, I could pursue an independent evaluation. I booked one immediately. I didn't tell Rachel. The evaluation was thorough, hours long, memory tests, reasoning exercises, neurological screening. I answered calmly, steadily. I felt clearer with every question, not because I was proving something, but because I was reclaiming myself. When the neurologist finished, she smiled and said, "Mrs. Harper, your cognition is well above average for your age." Above average. I asked her to put that in writing. When the report arrived, I sat in my car and cried again. But this time out of relief so intense it made me dizzy. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't imagining things. And now I had proof. But proof only matters if someone's willing to look at it. When I showed the report to Rachel, she didn't apologize. She didn't even seem surprised. She frowned slightly and said, "These things can fluctuate." She suggested second opinions, hers, not mine. That was when I realized the truth didn't threaten her. Control did. I began to understand that this wasn't about my health. It was about my assets, the house, the savings, the pension, all of it conveniently managed once I was declared confused. The emotional unraveling wasn't just mine. It was the unraveling of the illusion that love guaranteed safety. I'd believed deeply that no one who loved you would intentionally harm you this way. That belief shattered quietly, without drama, leaving clarity in its place. I contacted an elder law attorney recommended by my bank. I brought my notebook, my copies, my evaluations. He didn't look surprised. That hurt more than anything else. He said, "This happens more than people think." Hearing that made my hands tremble, not because I was weak, but because I wasn't alone. He explained my options carefully: how to lock down accounts, how to revoke any unauthorized access, how to document attempted coercion, how to prepare for the possibility that Rachel might escalate legally once she realized she was losing ground. I went home that evening and sat in the quiet. The house felt different. Still mine, but under threat. I walked from room to room, touching familiar objects like they might disappear. I thought about how easily women my age are dismissed when we say something feels wrong. How quickly concern can be weaponized. I didn't want revenge. I wanted safety and dignity and truth. But as I looked at my neatly written notes, my medical report, my bank statements, I realized something else was forming beneath the fear. Resolve. Rachel had underestimated me, not because she thought I was incapable, but because she thought I wouldn't fight back. She was wrong, and the next step I took would force her to choose between backing down quietly or exposing exactly what she'd been trying to do all along. Once I understood that Rachel wasn't going to stop simply because I had proof. The situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like a standoff. The kind where one person believes persistence will eventually wear the other down. The kind where silence is mistaken for surrender. I'd been quiet my whole life. She assumed I'd stay that way. I didn't confront her immediately. That would have been a mistake. Escalation doesn't always mean louder voices. Sometimes it means tightening the structure around you until the other person runs out of room to maneuver. I followed the attorney's advice carefully, step by step, like someone learning a new language late in life and refusing to mispronounce anything important. The first thing I did was reclaim my finances completely. I went to the bank in person, same branch, same manager. I brought my identification, my medical evaluation, and a calm voice. I revoked every permission Rachel had ever been given, spoken or written. The manager didn't argue. He didn't question me. He simply nodded and said, "I'm glad you came in." That sentence told me more than any apology could have. They'd been waiting for me to assert myself. Next came the accounts Rachel didn't know I knew about. The automatic transfers disguised as bill payments. The small recurring withdrawals she thought would go unnoticed. The bank's fraud department opened a file. Not a confrontation yet, just documentation. A quiet accumulation of facts that couldn't be argued with later. Rachel noticed the shift within days. She called, her voice tight, asking why her online access had been removed. I told her calmly that I was reorganizing my finances. She said that worried her. I said worrying wasn't evidence. She accused me of being defensive. I told her boundaries often look that way to people who don't respect them. That was the first time I'd ever spoken to her like that. Her response wasn't anger. It was panic. She began contacting people around me more aggressively. My pastor, a neighbor, even my cousin in Indiana, whom I hadn't spoken to in years. Suddenly, there was a narrative circulating that I was becoming difficult, that I was pushing people away, that I was confused but stubborn. Gaslighting doesn't stop when challenged. It adapts. I countered it quietly. I scheduled meetings in person. I brought documentation. I explained calmly that there had been an attempt to control my finances under the pretense of medical concern. I showed my neurological evaluation. I didn't ask anyone to take sides. I simply corrected the record. Watching people's faces change as facts replaced assumptions was unsettling, but necessary. You don't realize how quickly credibility can shift until you feel it moving back toward you. Rachel's next move was legal. I received a certified letter stating that she intended to petition the court for conservatorship based on ongoing cognitive concerns. It cited hearsay, no medical diagnosis, no financial analysis, just vague language and emotional framing. If I hadn't already been prepared, that letter might have destroyed me. Instead, it hardened my resolve. My attorney wasn't surprised. He said this was common when informal control failed. Formal control was the next step. He also said something that stayed with me. People who are actually concerned about safety don't rush to courts. People who are concerned about access do. We responded immediately, with evidence, with evaluations, with timelines, with bank records showing attempted unauthorized transactions. We didn't accuse, we demonstrated. The court scheduled a hearing. Rachel didn't expect that. She showed up confident, well-dressed, composed. She spoke about her worry, her fear, her love. She painted a picture of a daughter overwhelmed by responsibility. It was a good performance. I'll give her that. If emotion were evidence, she might have won. But emotion doesn't cancel documentation. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. I described the progression, the statements, the interference, the financial inconsistencies. I presented my medical evaluations. I answered questions clearly, calmly, without defensiveness. The judge listened, not sympathetically, critically. That difference mattered. Then my attorney presented the bank records. That's when the room shifted. Small withdrawals, repeated patterns, access attempts after permissions were revoked, notes from bank staff expressing concern about third-party pressure. Rachel's face changed, not dramatically, but noticeably. Control slipped. For the first time, she wasn't narrating. She was reacting. The judge denied her petition on the spot. But he didn't stop there. He ordered a referral to Adult Protective Services for review of potential financial exploitation. He used that phrase slowly, deliberately, like he wanted it to land. Rachel looked at me then, not with anger, not with sadness, but with something like disbelief, as if she genuinely hadn't expected consequences. Outside the courthouse, she confronted me, not yelling, whispering. She said I'd humiliated her, that I'd made her look like a criminal, that she'd only been trying to help. I told her help doesn't require deception, and concern doesn't require access to someone else's money. That's when she said something that confirmed everything I'd feared. She said, "You don't even need it anymore." Need it! As if my money, my home, my life were surplus to requirements now that I'd reached a certain age. As if longevity diminished entitlement. That sentence erased any lingering doubt. This had never been about safety. It had been about inheritance acceleration. The investigation moved quietly but steadily. Bank compliance, social services, requests for documentation. Rachel stopped calling, stopped messaging, stopped showing up. Silence this time wasn't strategy. It was retreat. I thought that would bring relief. It didn't. It brought clarity and grief. Not for the relationship we'd had, but for the one I'd believed in. It's one thing to be betrayed by greed. It's another to realize someone saw your aging as an opportunity. The escalation reached its peak, not with confrontation, but with exposure. Adult Protective Services substantiated the complaint. The findings were careful, restrained, devastating. Pattern of undue influence, financial coercion. Attempted misrepresentation of medical status. Phrases that sound clinical until you realize they describe your own child. Rachel's attorney requested a settlement meeting. I declined. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. Control had shifted irreversibly. The truth was documented. The system had seen it. My credibility had been restored, not because I argued harder, but because I prepared better. What surprised me most was how calm I felt once it was over. No victory rush, no desire to punish, just a deep, steady sense of finality. Some lines, once crossed, don't get redrawn. Rachel didn't lose everything. She lost access. She lost authority. She lost the ability to speak for me. And that loss mattered more than any financial consequence. As I locked my front door that night, I realized something important. I wasn't fighting my daughter anymore. I was protecting myself, and that shift meant the next phase of this story wouldn't be about fear or defense. It would be about what happens when someone who was almost erased steps fully back into her own life. And that, I knew, would change everything. The confrontation didn't arrive the way I'd imagined during all those sleepless nights. There was no dramatic showdown in my living room, no raised voices or slammed doors. Instead, it came dressed as a final conversation, requested through attorneys, scheduled in a neutral office with neutral furniture and a box of tissues placed deliberately in the center of the table. Everything about it was designed to feel reasonable, controlled, civil. That alone told me this wasn't about reconciliation. It was about containment. Rachel arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by her lawyer, a woman not much older than she was. I came with mine. We exchanged polite nods like strangers who'd once shared something intimate, and now pretended it never happened. Rachel looked tired, not guilty, tired, as if the stress of not getting her way had been more exhausting than the idea of what she'd tried to do. Her attorney opened with soft language. Concern, miscommunication, love. The words flowed smoothly, practiced. She said Rachel wanted to repair the relationship and avoid unnecessary escalation. I noticed she never used the word apology. That omission wasn't accidental. When Rachel spoke, she looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. Her voice trembled slightly, which might have been genuine, or might have been strategy. With Rachel, I'd learned not to assume either. She said she felt blindsided by how things had spiraled. She said she'd been acting out of fear. She said she never meant for authorities to get involved. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the way I'd taught her to sit when she was a child and wanted adults to take her seriously. There was a strange symmetry in that moment. Roles reversed, lessons returning. When she finished, my attorney asked if I wanted to respond. I nodded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply described what had happened. The statements she'd made, the appointments scheduled without my consent, the financial access attempts, the medical misrepresentation. I spoke slowly, deliberately, referencing dates and documents the way you do when you want clarity to do the heavy lifting. Rachel shifted in her chair as the timeline unfolded, not because it was new to her, but because it was being said out loud, in sequence, without emotional cushioning. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say, but which came out anyway. I trusted you, I said, and you used that trust as leverage. Rachel flinched, just slightly. Her lawyer cleared her throat and redirected the conversation toward next steps. They proposed boundaries, agreements, supervised involvement, a pathway to rebuild trust. The word rebuild landed oddly. You don't rebuild something that was deliberately dismantled. My attorney leaned forward then, his tone firm but not unkind. He outlined the findings from Adult Protective Services, the bank's fraud review, the court's decision. He explained, in plain terms, that any further attempts to interfere with my finances or medical care would trigger immediate legal consequences. Rachel's lawyer nodded, taking notes. Rachel stared at the table. Then she spoke again, and this time the mask slipped. She said she felt punished for trying to help, that everyone had turned against her, that she was being treated like a criminal when she'd only been thinking about the future. She said something that chilled me more than anything else that afternoon. She said, "You're acting like I did this to you. I was doing it for you." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was entitlement wearing concern like a costume. She genuinely believed that her intentions excused her methods, that her proximity to me gave her authority over me. I said quietly, "Doing something for someone doesn't require lying about them." The room went still. Rachel's attorney tried to steer things back toward compromise, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a reckoning, not dramatic, not explosive, just unmistakable. My attorney asked if Rachel had anything else to add. She hesitated, then said one last thing. She said she hoped I'd reconsider cutting her out. She said she was my only child. She said I'd regret this when I was really old. That's when I realized the confrontation wasn't about the past. It was about the future. She was still positioning herself as inevitable, as my final option, as if time itself were on her side. I stood up then, slowly, carefully. I didn't look at the attorneys. I looked at Rachel. "I'm not cutting you out," I said. "I'm stepping out of your control." Those words ended the meeting. The attorneys exchanged professional goodbyes. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Rachel lingered, as if waiting for something. A crack, a concession, a moment of weakness she could use to re-enter the narrative. I didn't give her one. Outside, the afternoon sun felt harsher than expected. I sat in my car for several minutes before driving away, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart steady. Not relieved, not angry, just clear. That evening, I went through my house room by room, not because I was afraid of losing it anymore, but because I wanted to see it with fresh eyes. This was my space, my life, not an asset to be managed, not a problem to be solved, not a timeline to be accelerated. Rachel sent a message that night. Long, emotional, accusing me of choosing institutions over family, of listening to strangers instead of blood. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to my attorney and then deleted it from my phone. Boundaries aren't statements. They're actions. The confrontation had clarified something essential. Rachel didn't want reconciliation. She wanted access. And once access was denied, the relationship she claimed to want had nothing left to stand on. That realization hurt more than any legal battle. It meant accepting that the daughter I thought I had and the one standing in front of me were not the same person. Grief came then, quietly. For birthdays I'd imagined sharing. For future holidays, now uncertain. For the version of motherhood I'd believed protected me from this kind of betrayal. But grief didn't undo resolve. In the days that followed, consequences unfolded without my involvement. Banks finalized safeguards. Medical providers updated records. APS closed the case with substantiated findings. Rachel's ability to interfere with my life was officially severed. I thought the story might end there. I was wrong, because when someone loses control publicly, they often try one last move in private. And Rachel still had one card left to play. Rachel's last move didn't arrive through lawyers or letters. It came through silence, strategic, calculated silence that tried to reset the board without admitting defeat. For weeks after the meeting, there were no messages, no calls, no indirect pressure through friends or church members. If I hadn't already learned how she operated, I might have mistaken it for acceptance, growth even. But silence from someone who thrives on control is rarely peace. It's planning. I used that time carefully, not to relax, yet, but to reinforce what I'd built. My attorney helped me finalize a comprehensive estate plan, one that removed ambiguity entirely, updated wills, medical directives, financial trustees, everything explicit, everything documented. I wasn't preparing for death. I was preparing for autonomy. There's a difference, and older women understand it instinctively. I also began talking to people I'd avoided before, not to vent, to clarify. I sat down with my pastor and explained, calmly and fully, what had happened. I showed him documentation. I told him I wasn't asking for intervention, just accuracy. He listened quietly and said something that surprised me. I wondered, he admitted, but I didn't want to offend your daughter. That sentence stayed with me. How often silence protects the wrong person because politeness feels safer than truth. Rachel's attempt to control the narrative had relied on one assumption, that I would stay quiet to preserve appearances. She underestimated how much damage appearances had already done. The real turning point came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman from the state licensing board. She spoke carefully, professionally. She said they were following up on a complaint Rachel had filed weeks earlier, alleging medical negligence and elder neglect. By me? According to Rachel, I was refusing necessary care and placing myself at risk. I felt my stomach tighten, not with fear, but recognition. This was the last card. I told the woman I'd be happy to cooperate. I emailed her my neurological evaluations, court documents, APS findings, and attorney contact information before we ended the call. There was a pause on her end, then a quiet, "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. That will be sufficient." 2 days later, I received confirmation that the complaint had been closed as unfounded. More than that, it had been flagged as retaliatory. That word carried weight. Retaliation changes how systems respond. It shifts scrutiny. Rachel didn't know yet, but she would. The following week, she tried to access my medical portal again. The system logged it. The attempt triggered an alert to my provider and my attorney. When confronted with the evidence, her lawyer withdrew representation. That detail mattered more than anything else. Lawyers don't walk away unless they see a sinking ship. Rachel called me that night, first time since the meeting. Her voice was frantic, stripped of its practiced calm. She said she was being treated unfairly, that people were misinterpreting her intentions, that she felt attacked. She asked me, finally, directly, to help her fix this. That was the turning point. Not because she asked for help, but because she asked for help without once asking how I was. I listened, let her speak, let her reveal what still mattered most to her. When she finished, I said, "Rachel, I can't fix consequences you created." She cried then. Real tears this time. I believed they were genuine. But remorse doesn't erase harm, and regret doesn't restore trust. Those things require accountability, and accountability requires letting go of control. She said, "I don't know how this got so out of hand." I answered honestly, "Because you never thought I'd stop you." There was a long silence after that. Not tactical, not manipulative, just empty. The next steps unfolded without drama. The licensing board issued a warning regarding false reporting. APS documented a pattern of coercive behavior. The bank finalized restrictions permanently. Rachel's access to anything related to my life, medical, financial, legal, was severed completely. What surprised me most was how quickly the fear evaporated once the system fully saw what had happened. It hadn't been my imagination. It hadn't been age. It had been strategy. Naming that changed everything. I began reclaiming parts of my life I'd put on hold while defending myself. I went back to volunteering at the library. I hosted friends for dinner again without worrying about how stories might be retold. I stopped checking my notebook obsessively because I no longer needed it for survival. Documentation had done its job. Rachel withdrew from public view. People noticed. Stories changed. The concerned, daughter narrative quietly collapsed under its own contradictions. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't need to. Truth, once anchored, doesn't require maintenance. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers, I came across photos of Rachel as a child. Birthday parties, school plays, moments when trust had been uncomplicated. I let myself grieve then, not for the present, but for the innocence that made this betrayal possible. Loving someone deeply doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The mistake is believing love absolves accountability. The real turning point wasn't Rachel's exposure. It was my internal shift. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had narrowly escaped something terrible, and started seeing myself as someone who had recognized danger and acted. That distinction matters. One is passive. The other is powerful. I also began speaking, quietly, about what had happened. Not publicly, privately, with other women my age who'd felt that same creeping doubt when someone questioned their competence. The same fear of not being believed. The same pressure to just let your kids handle things. Each conversation ended the same way. Relief, recognition, less isolation. Rachel sent one final message weeks later. Short, controlled. She said she hoped someday we could rebuild trust. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because trust isn't rebuilt by proximity. It's rebuilt by sustained, respectful behavior. And I wasn't willing to wait in limbo to see if that might happen. The turning point had passed. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. I wasn't fighting anymore. I wasn't defending anymore. I was living again. And what came next wouldn't be about conflict at all. It would be about consequences unfolding naturally, and the quiet, unexpected freedom that followed. By the time everything settled, there was no dramatic moment where I felt victorious. No scene where I stood taller or smiled wider because justice had been served. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more permanent. Safety. The kind that lets your shoulders drop without realizing they've been tight for months. The kind that allows you to breathe all the way in without bracing for the next accusation. Rachel didn't disappear overnight. She faded, slowly, predictably. Control, once lost, doesn't explode. It dissolves. Phone calls stopped first, then emails, then the carefully timed check-ins she used to justify involvement. What remained was silence. but not the threatening kind. This silence had boundaries around it, legal ones, documented ones, ones that didn't rely on my emotional endurance to hold. People around me adjusted too. That part surprised me more than anything. Neighbors who had once spoken to Rachel instead of me now addressed me directly again. My pastor apologized, not dramatically, just honestly, for not asking more questions earlier. The bank manager shook my hand one afternoon and said, "You handled this exactly right. Exactly right. Not emotional, not reactive. Prepared." The word that followed me everywhere for months was strong. People said it like it was a compliment. I nodded politely, but inside, I corrected it. I hadn't been strong. I'd been methodical. Strength implies force. What saved me was structure. I went back to routines that had nothing to do with defense. Morning walks, volunteering, cooking meals that took time because I enjoyed them, not because someone needed to be fed on a schedule. I stopped monitoring my own memory like a suspicious witness. I forgot small things again, where I left my reading glasses, what day trash pickup was, and instead of panicking, I laughed. Normal forgetfulness returned once fear left. Rachel attempted one final indirect reach, a message through a mutual acquaintance suggesting she wanted to clear the air. The phrasing told me everything. Clearing the air isn't accountability. It's reputation management. I declined politely and moved on. Closure doesn't require consensus. What stayed with me most was the realization of how close I'd come to losing everything. Not because I was incapable, but because someone I trusted understood the system well enough to exploit its assumptions. Older women are expected to defer, to soften, to accept help without asking questions. That expectation nearly cost me my autonomy. I began speaking with other women quietly, one-on-one, not as a warning, but as recognition. I told them what to watch for, how concern can turn into control, how documentation isn't paranoia, it's protection. Every conversation ended the same way. Relief, because so many had felt something was off, but hadn't trusted themselves enough to say it out loud. Rachel's consequences didn't come in the form of handcuffs or headlines. They came in limitations. She could no longer access my records. She could no longer speak on my behalf. She could no longer present herself as my caretaker without evidence. Systems had learned to ask for proof instead of assuming intention. That mattered more than punishment. Months later, I received a formal notice closing the final review. No further action required. Case resolved. I filed it away with the rest of the documents, not because I needed it anymore, but because it belonged to the story. Proof doesn't stop mattering just because danger passes. I thought about Rachel often, but not the way people expect. I didn't rehearse arguments or imagine reconciliations. I thought about how easily love can be used as a credential, how the word daughter can override reason in rooms where facts should matter more. I learned something painful but clarifying. Trust without verification isn't kindness. It's risk. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the spiral notebook I'd used in the beginning. The one filled with dates and notes and half-written questions. I flipped through it slowly. The handwriting was steady. Clear. Mine. I closed it and put it back, not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me of who I was when things got hard. The resolution wasn't that Rachel lost. It was that I didn't. I kept my home, I kept my money, I kept my credibility, and more importantly, I kept myself. When people ask if I'd do anything differently, I tell them no. Not because it didn't hurt, but because pain is sometimes the cost of refusing to disappear quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards. I didn't argue my sanity. I proved it. If Rachel ever comes back into my life, it will be on terms that don't require me to shrink, explain, or defend my competence. Until then, distance is not cruelty. It's maintenance. The story people remember won't be hers. It won't be dramatic or tragic. It will be simple. An older woman was told she was confused. She checked the facts, and she refused to hand her life over to someone who mistook age for weakness. That's not revenge. That's survival with dignity. Life didn't suddenly become joyful after everything ended. It became stable. And at my age, stability feels like luxury. It's waking up without scanning your phone for messages that might twist your day. It's opening your mail without bracing for missing statements or unfamiliar envelopes. It's sitting in your own living room and knowing, deeply, unquestionably, that no one can remove you from it with a signature and a story. The first real change I noticed was how my body responded. The tightness in my chest faded. My shoulders stopped creeping up toward my ears. I slept through the night without replaying conversations in my head, wondering how something I said might be used later as evidence. Fear leaves residue long after the threat is gone. But eventually, even residue fades if nothing new reinforces it. I started trusting my mind again. That sounds small. It isn't. For months, I'd second-guessed every thought, every memory, every instinct. Gaslighting doesn't just target your reality, it targets your confidence in having one. When that confidence returned, it felt like meeting myself after as long separation. Familiar, reliable, still here. People treated me differently too, not with pity anymore, not with cautious politeness. They spoke to me directly again, asked my opinion, waited for my answers. At church, someone asked if I'd chair a committee like I used to. The assumption that I was slowing down quietly evaporated once the narrative collapsed. It turns out competence doesn't disappear with age. Only recognition does. Rachel remained distant, not hostile, just absent. That absence carried consequences of its own. Invitations she once shared with me stopped arriving for her. People don't like uncertainty, and once doubt enters a story, it spreads faster than truth ever did. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't explain. I let her live with the version of herself she'd shown. Once, a mutual acquaintance said to me, she was just trying to help. I smiled politely and said, help doesn't require erasing someone. That was the end of the conversation. I revised my will one last time, not out of spite, out of clarity. I named beneficiaries who'd shown respect, not entitlement. I wrote a letter, not to Rachel, but to myself, documenting the lessons I didn't want softened by time. Memory fades, wisdom shouldn't. I also started keeping a different kind of notebook, not dates or evidence this time. Observations, small joys, mornings when the coffee tasted especially good, afternoons when I forgot my phone and didn't care, evenings when the house felt peaceful instead of guarded. Survival journals eventually become life journals if you let them. Every now and then, I think about how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd signed one more form, missed one bank call, trusted one conversation too much. The system doesn't protect older women automatically. It protects whoever sounds most confident. That truth should terrify people more than it does. But fear isn't what stayed with me. What stayed was clarity. I learned that concern can be weaponized, that love doesn't cancel accountability, that age does not equal incompetence. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that silence is only dignity if it's chosen, not forced. Two things stand out now, lessons I carry forward with quiet certainty. They called me confused. I called it documentation. I didn't get angry. I got protected. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if someone in your life has started speaking for you, managing things you didn't ask them to manage, questioning your memory instead of your consent, pay attention. You don't need to accuse. You don't need to panic. You need to document. You need to verify. And you need to trust the part of you that knows when something is off. Being older doesn't mean being weaker. It means you've survived long enough to recognize danger faster. I didn't lose my daughter that year. I lost the illusion that love guarantees safety. What I gained was far more valuable: autonomy, credibility, peace. Thank you for listening to Echo Lens Stories. If this story resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like yours deserve to be heard.